In the winter of 1938, down from the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a pregnant girl was carried on a stretcher made from flour sacks and hickory branches. She was just 17 years old, her spine curved like a question mark, her jaw set at an impossible angle. When the county hospital doctor first examined her, he discovered bones that had never properly fused, teeth that grew in layers like shale rock, and a skull shaped all wrong, compressed on one side as if squeezed by an invisible hand since birth. But what he found in her blood was what made him lock the examination room door and call the state health department. 3 times the tests came back. Each time, the numbers told the same impossible story. This girl's DNA was folded in on itself in ways the doctor had only ever seen in laboratory mice deliberately bred for genetic research. When he asked her family who the father of her baby was, they went silent, not defensive, not ashamed, just silent, as if he had asked a question in a language they didn't understand. Her name was kept out of every official record. The town she came from doesn't appear on most maps. And the baby she carried, the one that should never have existed at all, would reveal a bloodline so tightly wound around itself that scientists who later studied the case called it a genetic miracle she was even alive. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of the most inbred woman ever documented in American medical history. This is a story about what happens when families live too long in isolation. When bloodlines circle back on themselves generation after generation, when the same last names appear on both sides of a family tree until that tree becomes a wreath. It's about a place where everyone was kin to everyone else and about the terrible biological price that isolation demanded. For 80 years, the records were sealed. The family tried to burn what remained, but the truth, like bones in shallow ground, has a way of surfacing. The mountains of eastern Kentucky have always kept secrets. The hollows run so deep and narrow that each day, sunlight only touches the creek beds for a few hours. Until the 1950s, roads didn't reach some of these communities. Before that, families lived the way their great-grandparents had, in cabins made from chestnut logs, farming strips of bottomland along the creeks, speaking in dialects that preserved Elizabethan English phrases which had vanished everywhere else in America. For most of them, isolation wasn't a choice. It was geography. A family might settle a hollow in the 1790s, and 200 years later, their descendants would still be there in the same valley, farming the same exhausted soil. The outside world moved on. They stayed. And when you stay in one place long enough, when there are only 12 family names in a 20-mile radius, when the nearest town is a 2-day walk over mountain ridges, marriages start happening between people who share more than just a community. After a while, those distinctions stopped mattering. Everyone was related to everyone else in ways that would take a genealogist weeks to untangle. On both sides of her family tree, going back 5 generations, the same family name appeared. Her father's grandmother and her mother's grandfather were brother and sister. Her parents were second cousins. On one side, her grandparents were first cousins. The bloodline didn't just loop back on itself. It coiled like a snake eating its own tail. By the time she was born in 1921, the genetic damage was already written into her body. Her bones grew at wrong angles. Her organs developed in unusual positions. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a frame that looked childlike even in adolescence. She had seizures. She couldn't read, though whether that was from lack of schooling or cognitive damage, no one could say for certain. But she survived childhood, which was more than could be said for many of her siblings. The family Bible listed 14 children born to her parents. Only 6 lived past the age of 5. The pregnancy was discovered by accident. A traveling preacher who visited the hollow twice a year noticed her condition in the summer of 1938 and insisted someone take her to a doctor. At first, the family refused. They handled their own affairs. They always had. But the preacher was persistent, and eventually shame or fear or something else convinced them to bring her down the mountain. The doctor who examined her was a man named Harold Stevens. He'd been practicing medicine in rural Kentucky for 15 years and thought he'd seen everything the mountains could produce. Rickets, pellagra, tuberculosis, children with bodies twisted by malnutrition and neglect. But this girl was different. Her deformities weren't from poverty. They were from something deeper, something written into her before she was born. Dr. Stevens measured her skull and found it asymmetrical in ways he'd only read about in medical journals. He examined her hands and discovered partial webbing between her fingers. Her joints were hypermobile, bending backward at angles that made him wince. When he looked into her mouth, he found teeth growing in double rows, one set behind the other like a shark's. But it was the blood test that changed everything. He sent samples to a laboratory in Lexington, asking them to run a comprehensive analysis. When the results came back, the lab technician had written a note in the margin. Please confirm patient identity. These numbers suggest sample contamination or laboratory error. Dr. Stevens ran the test again. The same results. The girl's coefficient of inbreeding, a measurement of how much of her DNA was identical because it came from shared ancestors, was higher than any human case in the medical literature. It was higher than the Egyptian pharaohs, higher than the most isolated royal families of Europe. The laboratory estimated that her parents shared approximately 25% of their DNA, the same amount you'd expect from a brother and sister. When Dr. Stevens asked the family directly who the father of her baby was, they looked at him like he was speaking nonsense. One of her uncles finally said, "That's family business." Another said, "We take care of our own." Her mother, a woman who looked 70 but was probably 45, said nothing at all. Dr. Stevens became obsessed with the case. He started asking questions in town, carefully at first, then more directly. What he discovered was a community that had lived by its own rules for so long that those rules had become invisible to the people living under them. The hollow where the girl's family lived had a population of maybe 60 people, with only 4 family names among all of them. Marriages happened young, often arranged between families to keep land consolidated, to keep outsiders from coming in. A man might marry his first cousin, and no one would mention it. Their children might marry each other's children and still no one would say anything. It wasn't talked about because it didn't need to be talked about. It was just how things were. Dr. Stevens obtained birth and marriage records going back to the 1840s. He spent weeks constructing a family tree, connecting lines, finding the same names appearing over and over in different combinations. What he created looked less like a tree and more like a net, every line eventually connecting back to a handful of original settlers who'd claimed the hollow before the Civil War. He found siblings who married siblings from another family, creating double first cousins, children who shared all 4 grandparents. He found uncles who married nieces after their wives died. He found marriage licenses where both the bride and groom had the same surname and the same grandparents listed in county records. And when he traced the pregnant girl's lineage back far enough, he found that every single one of her 16 great-great-grandparents connected back to just 4 individuals. 4 people. That's how narrow the bloodline had become. The genetic consequences were everywhere once you knew what to look for. Higher rates of infant mortality, children born deaf or blind, adults with cognitive disabilities, a family where 3 generations of men all had club feet, another where seizures ran through the women like a hereditary curse. But the community had normalized it. They cared for their disabled relatives. They found work that people could do despite their limitations. They built a world where these things were just part of life, the price of living the way they'd always lived. The cost of keeping outsiders away and keeping the land in the family. The pregnant girl was just the most extreme example of something that had been happening slowly, generation by generation, for 150 years. The baby was born in October of 1938. Dr. Stevens was not present for the delivery. In her 8th month, the family took the girl back to the hollow, and whatever happened after that, they kept to themselves. No birth certificate was ever filed. No record exists in any hospital or county office. But Dr. Stevens heard things. Whispers from a midwife who'd attended the birth and left the hollow, saying she'd never go back. Stories from a man who delivered supplies up the mountain and saw something that made him refuse to return. The stories varied in details, but agreed on the essential fact. The baby had not lived long. Some said it was born dead. Others said it lived for a few hours, maybe a day. One account claimed it had been born so severely deformed that the family buried it immediately before anyone outside the hollow could see. Dr. Stevens tried to investigate, but the family had closed ranks. They wouldn't speak to him. They wouldn't speak to anyone. The state filed his report and did nothing. This was 1938. Rural Kentucky had bigger problems. The Depression was still crushing these communities. People were starving. A family marrying its own members in a remote hollow wasn't a priority. Dr. Stevens tried to publish his findings in a medical journal. He was rejected, too controversial, too sensational. One editor wrote back suggesting he'd misinterpreted his data, that the numbers he was claiming were simply impossible in a living human being. He kept his files anyway. Boxes of them, blood test results, photographs he'd taken of the girl's skeletal deformities, handwritten notes documenting his conversations with family members, genealogical charts that looked like impossible puzzles. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. When Dr. Stevens died in 1974, his daughter found the boxes in his attic. She donated them to the University of Kentucky Medical Library, where they sat in storage for 30 years before a genetic researcher stumbled across them. The researcher's name was Dr. Elizabeth Morehouse. In 2004, she was studying historical patterns of genetic isolation in Appalachian populations. She'd been looking through archival donations when she found Dr. Stevens's boxes, still sealed, covered in dust. When she opened them and saw what was inside, she immediately understood she was looking at something extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The blood work alone was unprecedented. Dr. Morehouse had access to modern genetic analysis tools that didn't exist in 1938. From Dr. Stevens's data, she could extrapolate what the girl's actual genetic structure would have looked like. The level of homozygosity, identical gene pairs inherited from both parents, was catastrophic. In a normal outbred population, you'd expect maybe 2 to 3% homozygosity. This girl's genetic profile suggested levels approaching 35 to 40%. To put that in perspective, most mammal species can't survive above 25% homozygosity. At that threshold, recessive genetic disorders start expressing themselves in clusters. The immune system weakens. Organs develop abnormally. Fertility drops. The body essentially begins to recognize itself as foreign. Dr. Morehouse published her findings in 2006 in the Journal of Genetic Medicine. She was careful. She used no names. She obscured the location. She presented the case as a historical curiosity, a cautionary tale about what happens when human populations become too isolated for too long. But she included Dr. Stevens's measurements, his photographs with faces obscured, and his genealogical charts. The paper caused a quiet stir in academic circles. Geneticists cited it as one of the most extreme documented cases of inbreeding in modern humans. Anthropologists used it to discuss the dangers of genetic bottlenecks in isolated populations. Medical ethicists debated whether such research should be published at all, whether it stigmatized rural communities that were already marginalized. But outside academia, almost no one heard about it. The family certainly didn't. They were still there, most of them still living in the same hollow. By then, the roads had reached them. Electricity had arrived in the 1960s. Some of the younger generation had left for jobs in Lexington or Cincinnati. But the oldest families remained, and they still didn't talk about the girl or what had happened to her baby. Dr. Morehouse tried to locate living relatives for follow-up genetic studies. She was refused at every turn. One elderly woman told her over the phone, "Some things are buried for a reason. Leave them buried." The girl herself disappeared from all records after 1938. Dr. Stevens's notes mentioned that he tried to check on her in 1940 and was told she'd died, though no death certificate was ever filed. Some accounts say she died in childbirth. Others claim she lived into the 1950s, hidden away in the hollow, cared for by family members who kept her out of sight. One distant relative interviewed decades later said she remembered a woman who lived in a cabin at the end of the valley. Someone the children were told never to bother. Someone who was touched and needed to be left alone. We'll never know for certain. The people who knew the truth are gone now. The cabin where she lived collapsed decades ago. The cemetery where her family buried their dead has been swallowed by forest. The wooden markers rotted away. The names forgotten. But the genetic legacy remains. Dr. Mohouse's research identified several living descendants of the family, people who had no idea they were part of this story. Some carried recessive genetic markers that could be traced directly back to that narrow, coiled bloodline. Most had left the mountains. Most had married outside the community. The bloodline was finally widening, diluting itself back toward normalcy. What happened in that hollow wasn't unique. It happened in isolated pockets all over Appalachia, in the mountains of West Virginia, in the remote valleys of Virginia and Tennessee. It happened on islands off the coast of Scotland, in alpine villages in Switzerland, in the Australian outback. Anywhere humans lived in small, closed populations for generations, the same genetic mathematics applied, the same slow collapse. The girl from our story was just the most extreme example that was ever documented. She was what happens when isolation becomes absolute, when a community folds in on itself so completely that the very code of life begins to break down. Her story is a reminder that we are not meant to live cut off from the world. That genetic diversity isn't just a scientific concept. It's survival. That bloodlines, like rivers, need to flow outward or they stagnate. She was born into a world that had already decided her fate generations before she existed. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting part of all. If this story affected you, leave a comment below. And remember, history isn't just what's written in books. It's what people refuse to write down. It's what families kept hidden. It's what we're only now brave enough to uncover.